All right, so welcome everyone to Martin Scorsese More Than Gangster Films. Before we get started, I would like to give a special thanks to our tech services maven, Jennifer Curry. This past Friday, I opened up my folder on my desktop, which featured everything I had in here for this PowerPoint, and the PowerPoint was gone. Not like, oh, I couldn't find it, maybe I misplaced it. It was gone. And you know, had near panic attack, and some tears later, Jen's like, I'm gonna go check on the server, see if I can find an old version. Thankfully she did. For whatever reason, my profile just ate my PowerPoint, and I was the dummy who did not back hers up on the G drive. Usually I'm good at that. This was, of course, the one time I forgot, but thank you, Jen. She is the reason we're having this program right now. So I'm going to get started and share the screen. And Todd will be monitoring the chat. So Martin Scorsese, More Than Gangster Films. The reason I did this was, number one, I am a big fan of Martin Scorsese. I might be one of the youngest big fangirls of Martin Scorsese. But I did it because about 2 years ago, the discourse on the internet was touched off by a pretty innocuous comment that he had made in an Empire interview, where someone asked about the Marvel MCU movies, and he said, yeah, tried them, they're not my thing. They're not what I consider cinema. And a whole bunch of fans just lost their minds, and a lot of the rhetoric was just, oh, well, what do you know? You only know how to direct gangster movies. And, you know, my initial thought was like, guys, IMDb is right there. But I think for a lot of people who may not be familiar with all of his work, they probably do just think of stuff like Casino, Goodfellas, Taxi Driver, not really a gangster movie, but they're kind of familiar with his most well-known features that happen to align with kind of mafia and mob films. So I wanted to look at his catalog and show that he is, I think, a far more varied director and a far more thoughtful director than a lot of people give him credit for. So who is Martin Scorsese? Well, filmmaker, writer, producer, does a lot of work in film preservation, which we'll get to. What are some hallmarks of his films? A lot of his movies take place in New York. He will have frenetic camera work if the situation calls for it. Some of his films like Silence or Kundun do not have that type of camera work. He'll have very well curated soundtracks, some of which are anachronistic. If you saw the film, say, Gangs in New York, there was some modern music in there, which were like, that wasn't here in the 1860s or 1840s. He has a lot of fast tracking in and out shots, and his characters and his stories will always deal with some kind of morality, or in some cases tackle one of the 7 deadly sins, or just guilt as a whole. He's won an Oscar. He's won multiple BAFTAs. I think he's won Golden Globes, Palme d'Ors, Emmys, pretty much any award you can think of. Martin has at least one of them. Sadly, he only has one Oscar, which a lot of people will tell you he should have more than one. His top 10, 2001: A Space Odyssey, 8.5, Citizen Kane. So those are kind of like the tried and true picks, films that truly broke ground for cinema. But then you look at some of the other films that he loves: The Leopard, Paisan, The Red Shoes, which he is the reason I watched The Red Shoes. He was actually such a fan of The Red Shoes, he became fans with one of the directors, Michael Powell. They had a lifelong friendship, and his editor, Thelma Schoonmaker, ended up marrying him. Jean Renoir's The River, The Searchers, Vertigo, and Ashes and Diamonds, which actually was recently on Turner Classics. So if you get a chance, watch that. And as I said, he talks about cinema like a fanboy. When you get to be someone of Martin Scorsese's caliber, who many people, I know when Roger Ebert was alive, he called Martin like one of the greatest American directors, or living American directors, you would think you'd kind of have a big head about you. But Martin, he's never one to call himself like a savior of cinema, or thinks that he's above anybody. For this program, I watched the Directors Roundtable for Vanity Fair. It featured Greta Gerwig, Todd Phillips, Lulu Wang, Noah Baumbach. And one of the things that struck me was, I mean, he had a longer resume than anyone else there. In some cases, Lulu Wang only had one film out. But rather than kind of talking like the, okay, I'm the teacher, everyone listen to me, he talked to them as if they were his fellow peers. And one of the best parts of that interview is him talking with Lulu Wang about kind of her fight to have her film, The Farewell, distributed and advertised and promoted in a way that she wanted and staying true to her vision. And you can watch this interview where he's just having more and more respect for her. And that's one of the reasons I like him on a personal level. He doesn't have this inflated sense of self. He really does love the craft, and he seems like he'd want to sit down and tell you 8 movies you should see before you die rather than talk about himself. So early years, born in 1942 in Queens and raised by working class Catholic parents. I mean, if you've watched any of his movies, I don't think the raised by Catholic parents comes as much of a surprise. He actually, as I note here, he wanted to be a priest as a young man, but he flunked out of minor seminary school, which kind of says now, like, of course, made, the right decision. Roger Ebert, who was also a friend of Scorsese, would call Scorsese a Catholic filmmaker. And if you ever read Ebert's reviews, he would talk about how Catholic themes, particularly that of guilt, ethics, morality, would come up in his films again and again, even in movies like The Departed. So how did Martin get into movies? Well, he had asthma, so couldn't really go out and play. Streets were kind of polluted back then. Couldn't go play sports, anything that involved a lot of running. And they couldn't go to the theater to see live shows, so movies were it. And that led to his fascination with films, to the point where he'd draw comics and then storyboards for his own little movies. So after flunking out of seminary school, he goes to NYU for both his graduate and undergraduate degree. He receives his master's degree in 1968, and he's actually currently on the Arts Dean's Council for NYU Tisch. And he made a couple of early short movies. What's a Nice Girl Like You Doing in a Place Like This? It's Not Just You, Murray and the Big Shave. Fun fact, we'll discuss this a little bit later, but Thelma Schoonmaker, who, Todd, am I pronouncing your name right? I've read it so many times, so? I'm just going to call her Thelma. I know that's a little disrespectful, but Thelma actually helped him edit his earliest short films as well. So she really has been with him from the beginning. But that led, both his short films and his time at NYU Tisch led to his first feature, which is Who's That Knocking at My Door, which features, if you're looking at this, that is a baby-faced Harvey Keitel, which if you've seen Harvey Keitel in films like Bad Lieutenant, this is a jarring image. I think that was when Todd and I first watched it, we're like, my God, he's baby-faced. Like, what happened? And then we're like, oh, the 70s happened. So this actually came out of an idea for a short film called Bring On the Dancing Girls. And when you watch this movie, it does feel a bit like it's 2 separate features. One is this young man named JR. He's a good old boy from an Italian Catholic neighborhood. He has fairly traditional ideas about, the difference between a broad and a girl. So kind of the, if you've heard the term, the Madonna and the whore complex, this movie kind of explores that. So part of that is him hanging with his friends in the old neighborhood. The other half is him blossoming romance with him and a young woman. We never learn her name, but she's played by Zena Bethune. She is someone who is in college. She has a little bit, she's from a higher socioeconomic part of the ladder. She has a little bit more education, a little bit more refinement, and kind of seems like they're working really well. And then he finds out that in the past, she is a victim of dating violence. And that whole, his conception, the Madonna and the whore complex, comes into play in his complete inability to handle what happened to her, and really pins it all on her. And I have to say, for a film that was made in the mid 60s, I was fairly shocked by how this film is 100% on her side, and he is depicted as someone who is completely in the wrong and emotionally immature to handle this. And there's actually a great scene at the end where he goes back to her and you're like, okay, maybe he's matured, but he then says, well, I forgive you and I'll marry you anyway. And her response is kind of a well, no, because if that's how you see me, this isn't going to work. And this is probably, I would say, the moment that stuck out to me from this film. And I do love watching first features because they're usually never perfect, but you start to see kind of where they're going to go. And there's a moment where Harvey Keitel's character says something incredibly cruel to this woman. And Scorsese just lets that moment land and lets the silence stay there. So just you, along with the characters, get to absorb the impact of that rather than letting it, become a screaming match or anything. He rather lets the silence speak for itself. And I again, it's not a perfect film, but for a first feature, I think it's I think it holds up very well for something made in the mid-60s. And when it premiered in 1967 at the Chicago Film Festival, it caught the eye of one budding film critic, and that was one Roger Ebert, who became a lifelong fan. And right here, I decided to put a little blurb from the review, and he said he saw this as the arrival of an important new director. And if you go back and read the stuff in the late 60s, you're like, he knew right there that this was someone to be watched. So the 70s, this is kind of up and coming / really making a splash Scorsese. We have Boxcar Bertha, which is sort of a pseudo exploitation film. It was a Roger Corman produced picture, and he was, a guy who made movies cheap. He made them quick, definitely B movies, but Roger Corman himself and his machine launched a ton of careers. Scorsese was one of them. 73, he reunites with Keitel and then gets Robert De Niro, and they make Mean Streets, which you could kind of see as an extension of the more JR and his friends part of Who's That Knocking at My Door. And that's kind of the breakthrough in the arrival for Martin Scorsese, where a lot of film critics like Pauline Kael are like, okay, this is a guy to watch. And this was also around the time of New American Cinema. This came about in the late 60s after the big studios kind of collapsed, and we saw just this resurgence of a lot of new young voices, in many cases, young voices who had been raised on movies and kind of wanted to make their name in this industry. 74, he does Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, which again, a lot of people might not be a little shocked to find out that that's a Martin Scorsese picture, because it's a quiet movie about a widowed woman trying to start a new life. That ends up winning Ellen Burstyn, the star, an Oscar, and then kind of makes Scorsese bankable. And then in 76, Taxi Driver hits, and that is really the meteoric moment for him, where it's not just this is a guy to watch, this is one of the guys that's defining American cinema. Unfortunately, Taxi Driver was followed up with New York, New York, which is, I will say, very hard to find. Try to track it down. There aren't really many physical copies, and it's not on streaming. And the reception to that, along with the very troubled production, really kind of drove Scorsese deep into an addiction with cocaine, although not to stereotype, but it was the 70s. I kind of figured everyone was doing drugs back then. But had Robert De Niro in the early 80s helped him kind of kick that addiction. He does end the 70s on a bit of triumph, though, because he directs the great documentary The Last Waltz. So that is a nice way to finish up, but he kind of had this really big rise, and then New York, New York was, if you ever read reviews, they're like, what happened? You have these 3 great movies, and then there were some people wondering if it was already over for Martin at this point in time. So I'm going to spotlight one movie from the decade because this guy is such a vast filmography. We can't go over everyone individually. And I think you've got to spotlight Taxi Driver from the 70s. Again, if Mean Streets was kind of the breakthrough, this is the true arrival. This is where pretty much everything we like about Martin Scorsese comes together and absolutely works. I think it's a perfect movie. It's grimy. It's disturbing. it's unsettling. Travis Bickle is a character that scares me because at the end of the day, we don't quite know what's going on in his head and we don't quite know what's motivating him. And I don't even know if he quite knows what's motivating him. You have a great script by Paul Schrader, who, you know, Brian De Palma hit or miss as a director, but we have him to thank for Schrader and Scorsese teaming up in the first place and creating this picture. The studios were pretty apprehensive about it. They were really unsure if this was going to work. It ends up getting almost grossing almost $30 million, the equivalent of 117 million today, which for an R-rated feature is pretty big deal. I do love this one quote from Scorsese because he's talking about making it, and a lot of movies made in the 70s about New York, we kind of call them the bad New York pictures. There's stuff like that, The Warriors, where I think a lot of people just thought New York was a war zone that you didn't want to be in. I mean, don't get me wrong, New York was going through a rough time in the 70s, but Scorsese just kind of said like, oh no, this is just New York to us. And so he talks about New York now. He goes, I must admit it's safer, and that's good. I don't miss the way 42nd Street was when we shot Taxi Driver. It was horrible. However, it's just as horrible now. Only you can bring the kids. Which, if you have ever been to Times Square, I 100% agree. There is an interesting bit about Taxi Driver. So there's an interview from 1976 with Roger Ebert with both Schrader and Scorsese. And he was talking about Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, and they're talking about Taxi Driver. So Ebert asks, will it take a feminist position? A lot of people embrace Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore as feminist. Scorsese, well, it'll be about the problems of a career marriage. Actually, no, this is talking about New York, New York. I don't know if it's feminist. Actually, not Alice, but Taxi Driver. That's my feminist film. Who says a feminist movie has to be about women? Alice was never intended as a feminist track. In the end, she's making the same mistakes. The first shot of her in Kris Kristofferson's house shows her washing the dishes, a big close-up. Ebert. And Taxi Driver, where the hero can't relate to women at all, is Scorsese. Feminist, because it takes macho to its logical conclusion. The better man is the man who can kill you. This one shows that kind of thinking, shows the kinds of problem that some men have, bouncing back and forth between the goddesses and the whores. The whole movie is based visually on that one shot where the guy is being turned down on the telephone by the girl and the camera actually pans away from him. It's too painful to see that rejection. And that little note of Taxi Driver being a movie that takes macho-ness to its logical conclusion is, thinking back and watching that, fairly on point. And if we're looking at his earlier film, Who's That Knocking at My Door, and kind of juxtaposing that with Taxi Driver, we do see that Scorsese is not exploring the Madonna and the whore complex, but he's exploring that with men and how men will kind of put some women on pedestals and then think others are just not worth it at all. So kind of makes you want to go back and rewatch Taxi Driver again and go like, all right, I need to watch that with this interview in mind now. Granted, again, I don't know what Martin was on when he was giving this interview, so potentially he might go like, kind of zonked when I said that. So we're going to move on to the 80s, which is a difficult decade for Scorsese. You know, the early to mid ones, we had a lot of struggles. So we had his first big failure, which was New York, New York. He does, however, get Raging Bull, which is a film, even though it was mixed at the time, has been redeemed by history. And it did, even when it came out, people like Roger Ebert were 100% in its corner saying this is a great film. Raging Bull, also famous because if you follow Oscars, nominated for 8, Thelma won Best Editing, Bobby De Niro won Best Acting, but it lost Best Picture to Ordinary People, and it lost Best Director to Robert Redford. So many people saw that as the first of the Academy's slights towards Martin, which I kind of feel bad for Ordinary People. It's really not a bad movie on its own, but just the shadow that it has now in terms of what it beat. Then he follows it up with another collaboration with De Niro, which is The King of Comedy. This one, pretty well received by critics at the time. Audiences hated it, and it was a complete box office bomb. And like Raging Bull, King of Comedy has been rehabbed in the court of public opinion in terms of a very biting satire about the desire for fame. And again, when you watch it now, especially in the age where people can become Instagram influencers and find fame that way, or reality TV show fame, or people who specifically go on to these shows to be famous, the King of Comedy, I think, hits better now than it probably did when it came out. If anything, it's a little bit prescient. 1985, we have After Hours, starring one of my favorite actors, Griffin Dunn, which was pretty much what he made when his first attempt to make Last Temptation of Christ fell through. It ended up winning him Best Director at Cannes, although Scorsese's talked about After Hours, and he's like, I think Roger Ebert and critics are bigger fans of it than I am. But I think a lot of that is emotionally how he feels about it. But After Hours, again, didn't make a ton of money. So then he does The Color of Money, which is, I should say, a for the money, dear boy film. Scorsese's been very open. He goes like, I did that because I needed to make a hit. And it was. And it also got Paul Newman Best Actor, and it gave him the clout he needed to make, which we're going to get to, The Last Temptation of Christ, which is, Todd, the second most controversial movie featuring Jesus. It was the only one until Mel Gibson decided to make his movie, but
well, I mean, unless you want to cheat and count that dream sequence in The Devils, but yeah.
Okay. Oh, good point. I love how pretty much the Devils are referenced at least once in any of our programs. So I would like to spotlight After Hours. So again, of all of it, this is my favorite film of his from the 80s, probably because it's a little more lighthearted. King of Comedy is really biting, but there's a darkness in that movie where it's not a movie you watch all the time. And Raging Bull is an emotionally rough watch, because you're watching a character who's really putting themselves through the ringer. It's like watching your Darren Aronofsky's Mother. I like it. I just don't want to watch it all the time. But this is Martin Scorsese doing a black comedy. So you have Griffin Dunn. He's pretty much an office clerk guy, meets a girl at a bar, decides to go see her, and then just I wouldn't say hilarity, but strangeness ensues. And again, Kafka-esque is something that's thrown around, but I almost consider it kind of Lynchian. There's a lot of things that kind of remind me of David Lynch in this movie, but Scorsese actually considers it a tribute to Alfred Hitchcock. Kind of this idea of this, man who is wrongfully accused being pursued by a greater group of people, just trying to make it back safely. And fun little fact about this, Michael Powell, who directed The Red Shoes, and again, Scorsese became friends with him in his career. He actually helped out with the ending of this movie, kind of giving him pointers. It's a lot of fun. I'd love to see it get a newer release and get a cleaned up print, but I really like it. You also see early Rosanna Arquette, Linda Fiorentino. Also, if you are a Schitt's Creek fan, Catherine O'Hara is in this in a bit part. It's a really surprisingly loaded cast, and it's a lot of fun. Even though it gets kind of dark at times, but it's a really good take on a dark comedy, and it's almost got a screwball nature to it, which I appreciate. And I don't think anyone else could have made After Hours quite the way Martin Scorsese made it. I think if someone else had done it, it would probably be more madcap. It wouldn't have that sense of menace to it. It's a really unique piece. So now we're going to probably what a lot of people came here for. I've discussed this before. I've talked about it in my film censorship program, the controversy of The Last Temptation of Christ. So a little bit of background on this whole situation. So The Last Temptation of Christ is a book written by Nikos, I'm really hoping I don't butcher this name, Kazantzakis or Kazantzakis. He's Greek Orthodox. He wrote in 1955, and it was about the human side of Jesus. So it explores the idea that he didn't want to be crucified. He didn't maybe want to be the Messiah. He would instead take wives. He had relationships with women. However, this book was not written to shock. This book was not written to be vulgar or to debase anybody's faith or religious figures. This was written to explore something that in theology is talked about, which is Christ or Jesus was part human. And, what would happen if the human side of him kind of started to question, can I be the Messiah? Am I really meant for this role? I have not read the book, but the film kind of goes into that. So Scorsese first encounters this book when Barbara Hershey is working with him on Boxcar Bertha back in the early 70s. She had been reading it. She gave it to him, and since then he really wanted to make that book, or make the movie out of this book. He tried and failed a number of times, and other people had wanted to make it as well. Apparently Sidney Lumet was attached at some point. And in the early 80s, he was almost there to getting this film made. And then the deal falls through. And this is post King of Comedy, and that's how we get After Hours. As Scorsese puts it, he's like, I kind of wanted something to take my mind off of, what I consider to be a failure. So the book was already controversial. And when the first attempt was made to make this movie, the televangelist circuit, which had been growing in both exposure and power, had already started to ramp up their campaign against this film. Now, mind you, this book exists that everyone could read, but there was nothing put to print on this movie. However, back in 1983, televangelists were already telling people what would be in this film. No way of knowing it. So Donald Wildman, he's part of the National Federation of Decency, which I got to tell you, as a librarian and someone who frequently reads about censorship, people wanting to censor, books and items. Anytime I see something called the National Federation for Decency, I immediately think, oh, you're going to want me to remove a whole bunch of books, aren't you? So they started this campaign in 1983 when he was first looking to adapt the story. And when the film finally came out later in the 80s, 2.5 million action packets were sent to Christians telling them to oppose this movie. So for me, when I read that, that does not speak of a grassroots campaign of people who just heard about this film and were disgusted by the idea. This speaks to me as something that was manufactured outrage and a manufactured controversy. And there is a book, I am blanking on the name of the book right now. You could actually email me later about it, but there is, I think it's called Hollywood Under Siege, that is all about this issue. And it goes into how a lot of televangelists saw this as a fundraising opportunity. Actually, Paul Schrader, when someone talked to him about making this film, he said the same thing, goes, they just saw it as a way to get their name out there and make more money. And he had a fairly cynical view of a lot of the reaction to it. But Scorsese and Universal, who eventually decided to make the feature, they did want to alleviate a lot of concern, and they didn't want to have people so angry that it could just, hurt the film. So they even hired a man named Tim Penland, who was a religious marketing expert. He actually eventually left because he was not happy with what he had heard going on in the film. And eventually a lot of religious leaders just condemned the film before it even came out. Again, there were a lot of rumors about what was on film, which ended up never even being there, and in some cases not even put to celluloid. And it really just ballooned into a big hubbub. We don't really have too many protests over films nowadays, and I certainly wasn't cognizant enough to remember this. The last time I think there was this much controversy over a single film probably was The Passion of the Christ. But people really were ready to condemn this film without having seen it. And what was interesting is, rather than just saying, I don't think you should see this movie, I wouldn't recommend it, or even just, I don't want to watch it, they said no one else should see it either. So simply because I don't want to watch it, no one gets to watch it. fact, Bill Bright, who led the Campus Crusade for Christ, he actually had a plan. He was going to raise $10 million and then go to Universal. He had actually talked to them and said, just, I'll give you $10 million. I know I can raise it if you sell me the film print and let me destroy it. And he would, like, he said, he's like, I will send pictures of this being destroyed. And he kind of said, this will satisfy us, is if you take a piece of art that people, hundreds of people spent so much time making and just let us destroy it so no one can ever see it. That's fine. Which again, that's usually how censors work. They just kind of have the, well, I don't like it, therefore no one gets a chance to see it.
Sounds familiar.
Oh, I know. I don't know what person or event from a few months ago you could possibly be referring to. But in addition to the Bill Bright's offer, there were protests against theater chains, including some theater chains saying we're not going to show it. Some towns considered banning it, which that pretty much got turned down very quickly because they're like, you can't really do that. And in addition to the calls for censorship, there was an attack in a movie theater in Paris. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but it was an arson attack and people were injured. Lou Wasserman, who was the chair of MCA, he was the target of fairly extreme anti-Semitic harassment and attacks. I'm not going to show images of that because it's not very comfortable to look at. And Scorsese had later disclosed to Ebert, like, oh, I needed bodyguards for about 2 years because I had death threats. There's from the book, I do want to read this from the book. It's called Conversations with Scorsese. It's Richard Schenkel. This is just a little piece of the conversation they had. Martin says, I expected some controversy, but I expected it to be intelligent. I expected discussion and dialogue. Richard says, not in America, pal. Martin, well, it was amazing. And Richard said, you were at the beginning of the period we're in now. The fundamentalists were already feeling their oats in that moment. Martin said, it was, of course, condemned by the church from the pulpit, and they sent out their army, so to speak. And Martin ends with saying, by the time I appeared on Nightline on TV, I was supposed to confront our critics, and I had thrown in the towel. I couldn't fight them anymore. I was just satisfied with the picture had been made. And, you know, I actually think this film is a wonderful film. It's a film that I think is challenging. I definitely get why some people, if they were to hear about that happening, would be a little incensed. But if you watch it in the context of the film, it makes sense. And as I talked about in my censorship program, context is everything. You can't take one bit of a film or one line from a book or one image and then put it completely out of context and say, this is why something should never be seen. Or worse, take the right away from other people to make that choice themselves. There were defenders of The Last Temptation of Christ when it came out, both Siskel and Ebert, both men of faith in their own right. I believe Siskel was Jewish and Roger Ebert was Catholic and talked about his faith a lot. They both felt that this was a very wonderful film, a very spiritual film. And Ebert talked, he said, I actually felt that this was a fascinating film from a theological standpoint. And he felt it was an affirming film at the end because it showed the crucifixion not as a tragedy, but as something that is triumphant for Earth as a whole. And there was also the Reverend Paul Moore, and he was an Episcopalian bishop of New York, and he wrote a letter to the editor to the New York Times about the discussion of this film. I won't read all of it, but the last paragraph says, some people may be upset at seeing Christ depicted as fully human, but he was. I hope wiser heads than the ministers who threatened boycott will go to the movie and will be as moved by it as I was. Incidentally, it seems strange that they would be criticizing a movie that they have not even seen. So I guess in short, go watch Last Temptation of Christ. I think it is a great movie. Amazing performance by Willem Dafoe. One of the things I liked was that everyone kind of looks a little dirty and raggy. No one looks polished, which I'm like, well, you obviously would. Great performance by Barbara Hershey, Harvey Keitel. I think it's a wonderful film. And again, I think the the best thing to do when there's controversial material is decide if you want to see it yourself, and if you do, make your own decision. But moving on from that, for something a little happier, and a little less taxing on Martin Scorsese's psyche, was directing the Bad video for Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson had an eye for directors, and he loved cinema. There were films that inspired a lot of his videos. He saw American Werewolf in London and was so impressed, he called John Landis and was like, get in here and get Rick Baker to make Thriller. Francis Ford Coppola worked with him on Captain EO. And this is pretty much Martin bringing the whole gang to make this short film, which is about 18 minutes. So Richard Price, who made The Color of Money, wrote the script. Thelma came and edited it, and Michael Chapman did cinematography. It is up in full on YouTube. Some of the iffier stuff about Michael Jackson aside, the videos, for especially from the Bad and the Thriller era, are fantastic, and it's a really well directed video. And it's a time that doesn't exist we don't really have that anymore, where big name directors will just go make music videos now. Moving on to the 90s, probably Scorsese's most successful decade, but also the one where he took a lot of risks, especially towards the back half. So he has Goodfellas. He opens that up with 1990, and that is such a good recovery from everything that Last Temptation of Christ brought his way. Martin was definitely not proud of Last Temptation of Christ, but the whole controversy took a lot out of him. And as that interview showed, he had been prepared to have to defend his movie to some people, but I don't think he expected death threats. He didn't expect arson attacks on theaters. He didn't expect someone saying, I want to destroy the master print so no one ever has to see this. And if you're someone who's an artist or someone who just cares about intellectual freedom, that isn't just something that's silly, that's something that just hurts your soul in many. And I say this as a librarian. For me, I see a proposition like Bill Bright's, and I'm like, okay, you and I are going to go have a discussion outside, because that's ridiculous and borderline fascistic, really, the idea of no one can ever see this because I don't want you to. But we have Goodfellas, the life of Henry Hill and his time in the mafia. It starts off so fun, and then it just gets worse, and then he gets hooked on drugs, and then he has to go into witness protection. It's a really, it's often remembered as kind of being a like, oh, isn't the mob fun? But you watch the whole movie, the whole back half of that is Henry Hill's just really, really big fall. It also has one of my favorite just performances in any movie, and that is Lorraine Bracco. I almost called her Dr. Melfi because we're watching The Sopranos right now, but Lorraine Bracco screaming at Janice Rossi. I can't play the clip because YouTube might flag us, but just her saying, "Is this the superintendent?" is one of my favorite bits in any film. It's the original Karen moment, but a little more justified, really. He follows that up with Cape Fear, which was another kind of I did this for money. So when he made Last Temptation with Universal, they said, okay, we'll let you make this. You got to make us a more mainstream picture. And he said, fine, just let me pick. He chose to remake 1962's Cape Fear and definitely make it a little bit grittier, a little bit more dangerous, a little bit more overt in its danger. I actually think it's one of the remakes that works overall. Robert De Niro is terrifying in it. This is Nick Nolte kind of in Prince of Tides era where he wasn't quite Todd, you can do the Nick Nolte voice for me.
See, for something that you're getting with the adjective craggy.
Yeah, but you can do the Nick Nolte voice that he has now.
Oh, I don't know if that's really gonna work here.
Yeah, before he reached that Nick Nolte, and also I believe the debut of Juliette Lewis, and he then follows that up with, again, what a lot of people consider to be sort of a left field turn, which was The Age of Innocence. But for filmmakers filmmakers and critics who saw him as someone who is very good at observing people and observing societies and observing groups and group interaction, they saw it as like, oh, this is a no-brainer. Then he kind of goes back to the mob with Casino, which Todd, I gotta admit, everybody, I haven't seen Casino, so Todd, you've got to take over for me.
Well, I mean, your description kind of puts it pretty well. Honestly, it's a good movie on its own. I think the biggest issue I have with it is like it's kind of, and you watch it, you see a lot of the same beats from Goodfellas. So it's through no fault of its own. It's kind of living in the earlier film's shadow. But again, on its own, it's still a strong movie.
97, which was Kundun, which I remembered wanting to see it when it came out, and my parents were pretty adamantly no. Probably because they saw Martin Scorsese's name on it, and they're like, "Isn't the guy that directed Goodfellas?" I don't know. But Kundun is about the life of the 14th Dalai Lama. He was interesting story. When Roger Ebert reviewed the film, he says, "Oh, I imagine that Martin was really inspired by the film The Flowers of St. Francis." And then later in the book, Scorsese by Ebert, Ebert talks about seeing Martin shortly after Kundun came out and kind of talking to him about The Flowers of St. Francis. And then Martin just launches into, oh, what a great movie. You have to see it, and just how it inspired him. But Kundun was the first time I had seen, I'd been kind of exposed to that culture and seeing stuff like the sky burial, which, if you're not familiar with that, is a death ritual, is one that I could see in the hands of a different filmmaker being shown and portrayed a lot differently and maybe a lot more horrifically. But the way Scorsese films it, he's very respectful of the culture, even though he's clearly not a part of it. And he finishes it out with Bringing Out the Dead, which is a really wild movie. And it's, if I had to think of what it reminds me of a lot of, it's Uncut Gems. Not, they're not about the same type of person, but kind of that level where you feel like you're constantly on edge and you're kind of close to having an anxiety attack because a lot of things are happening. You have Nick Cage, who took this movie specifically because he's like, I want to work with Martin Scorsese. Just a burned out pandemic. It's 3 days in his life, and there are just some scenes in there where you're just like, again, you're really anxious because you feel like something bad's gonna happen. I can just feel it. So he has a good start to the 90s, but unfortunately between Kundun and Bringing Out the Dead, both of those, they don't do well at the box office. So he kind of ends out the decade with two big failures on his hands and kind of looking at where can he go from here. So I'd love to I really wanted to originally do Goodfellas because, again, that movie's great, but everything that needs to be said about Goodfellas has been said. And I don't think people talk about The Age of Innocence enough, both as a Scorsese film and just as a film in general. It is one of those films that is so brimming with passion. It's not smutty by any means, but you can feel the passion in this film. In Merchant Ivory films, stuff like Room with a View, that never hit me really well. I never connected with those films. I 100% connected with The Age of Innocence, and just the sense of, of love, the sense of longing and desire, and the sense of loss that you get in this film. It's based on Edith Wharton's novel. One of Scorsese's friends gave him this book and said, if you ever do a romantic film, this needs to be it. And Scorsese decided, okay, I'm going to do it. Again, he kind of had some clout now behind him. He had 2 hits. So you have Daniel Day-Lewis, a high society man. He's engaged to a young socialite played by Winona Ryder. And then her cousin comes in from Europe. She's recently left a count. And he's enamored with her, and a lot of this speaks to how good the actors are as well. Michelle Pfeiffer and Daniel Day-Lewis. Again, you feel this romantic tension, and I think there's sexual tension as well, but you feel that, but you also feel this intellectual attraction that they have to each other, that they relate to each other. And so when the film goes the way it does, you're so devastated by the end of it. It is a beautiful, tragic romance. It's so romantically filmed. And And it's interesting, like reading Scorsese's interviews, and now he talked about this. So Conversations with Scorsese, he talked about like the control that Victorian society has on the people that inhabit it. He goes, it's not that much different than the control that the mafia can exert over its members. And he was speaking with Ebert about this, and he said he actually thinks Age of Innocence was at the time his most violent film. Quote, what stuck in my head is the brutality under the manners. People hide what they mean under the surface of language in the subculture. I was around when I grew up in Little Italy. When someone was killed, there was a finality to it. It was usually done by the hands of a friend. And in a funny way, it was almost a ritualistic slaughter, a sacrifice. But New York society in the 1870s didn't have that. It was so cold-blooded. I don't know which is preferable, which as someone who was raised in the South for a bit of her life, there's also sort of the thing of like, if a Southern person says, bless your heart, it's just like, oh God. It's like, I'm a marked person now, but it's a film that kind of explores that in these quote, civilized societies where everyone speaks well and has manners, there's just as much cruelty and brutality as in quote unquote, less cultured societies. It's a wonderful film. Criterion did a remaster of it a few years ago. Would 100%, if you've never seen this film, would recommend watching it. So moving on to the aughts, and this is, to me, I would say probably the most underwhelming decade for me when it comes to Rogers films. Nothing really stuck out to me. They're all, none of them are bad movies. There's good sequences in them, but Gangs of New York, The Aviator, The Departed is the best of the three. They all kind of leave me feeling a little bit cold, or there's something unfinished about it. Gangs of New York, so Scorsese's kind of said, especially in his interviews with Ebert and in conversations with Scorsese, that there was a lot of behind the scenes drama with Weinstein in terms of how long he wanted to make it, what the budget was, and wanting to have real sets. I got the sense that it didn't turn out 100% the way he wanted it. I don't think it's a bad film. I love the final few minutes of that movie where you just see the graveyard and in the background, New York just building itself up. I think that's a great sequence. The Aviator, which is about Howard Hughes, is, again, it's a great movie, but I don't have the connection to it that I've had to his other films. Great performances in that though. Cate Blanchett as Katharine Hepburn is the standout. You also have a very young, I'm blanking on the actor's name, but I'm just going to call him Gavin Belson because that's who he played on Silicon Valley, is in it. You have Alan Alda, who is always great to see. And The Aviator does end on a chilling note because Scorsese said what attracted him to the screenplay is where it ends. We don't see his whole life. We don't see him become like the hermit living in his house with tissue boxes everywhere, but it ends on this note where you know that's where he's going to end up. It's a fairly dark ending for the film. And then you have The Departed, which is based on a Hong Kong film transferred to Boston. And that finally wins him his Oscar, finally wins him Best Director, but there were a number of people who were like, but between Raging Bull and The Last Temptation of Christ and Goodfellas and Casino, they're like, it's a makeup award, essentially. Although again, I have a soft spot for The Departed as it is about Boston, which is why it is the film I'm spotlighting. And Todd, I told you, you can get one bit out with the Boston accent.
We talked it over. We were going to try and get the rights for the dropkicks for this, but you know how much they charge? We can't afford that, bro.
Alrighty. Okay, got that out of your system. This is the film that gets Martin his Oscar, and I don't think it's quite an antithesis to Goodfellas because Goodfellas is also very blunt with how brutal the world of the mob is. But there is a brutality in this that I almost don't even see in Goodfellas. Goodfellas, there is still the sense of like, we have manners here, we have ways that we're going to conduct ourselves. When you have Costello's gang will just beat your hand with a shoe if they think that you might be trying to snitch on them. There isn't any manners to this. And it's just, you know, poor Leonardo DiCaprio's character is just, rather than it being kind of a suave undercover role, as we might see in another sort of undercover cop film, he's constantly stressed out and ready to crack and worried that he's going to be killed. And then you have Mark Wahlberg saying, well, if you screw this up, we're just going to erase your file and leave you hanging. It's a very dark film. And I would say of the three, it is his best. And again, it did finally win Martin his Best Director Oscar. I was a little bit peeved that year because I think Best Director should have gone to Guillermo del Toro for Pan's Labyrinth or Alfonso Cuarón for Children of Men, which, by the way, Children of Men and Pan's Labyrinth, two of the best movies made in the past 20 years. But I love Martin. I'm glad he finally got his Oscar. I don't think he cared about it nearly as much as everyone else did. Also win Best Adapted Screenplay, which I think if it deserved any award, that was it, because transferring it from a Hong Kong setting to Boston that takes a lot of work to kind of do the, reworking it for a different culture. Also, of all the actors nominated for this movie, Mark Wahlberg was the one who got the nomination, not Jack Nicholson, shockingly. And this is also, if you are a Jack Nicholson fan, you are probably well aware that he really doesn't act anymore. From everything I've heard, it's medical reasons why. This is truly what I would consider to be his final film, and what a great performance to go out on. And with that, we're going into the 2010s, which I consider to be kind of Martin getting his mojo back. The good thing about the aughts was all three movies he made were both critical and commercial successes. So he had a lot of clout going into the 2010s. And he teams up with DiCaprio again for their fourth film in a row, which is Shutter Island, which is based on the Dennis Lehane novel, which is kind of Martin Scorsese making a horror movie, which I'm always here for, slash a thriller. And some of it was actually inspired by the Ida Lupino film, The Hitchhiker. He said he took inspiration from that, inspiration from old Hitchcock films. With 2011, we have Hugo, which we'll discuss in a moment. 2013, we have The Wolf of Wall Street, which had probably the most controversy since The Last Temptation of Christ. The depiction of hedonism in it had a lot of people going, how is this not condoning this? To which Scorsese said, I think any viewer who watches this movie knows that I'm not condoning this, which I am 100% with him. You watch The Wolf of Wall Street, there's a couple of scenes where they'll remember something one way. They're like, oh, we partied with stewardesses on a plane. But then it will cut very immediately to what actually happened, which is the stewardesses were like, get these people off of me. They're on drugs and they're creepy. There was the other criticism that I think potentially carried a little bit more weight were people saying, in the wake of the 2008 crash, in which a lot of normal everyday people lost everything to predatory people like Jordan Belfort, potentially it was in bad taste, but which again, a criticism I think holds a little bit more weight. However, what are films and art supposed to be if not a reflection of our times? After making a lot of money with The Wolf of Wall Street, that is still Martin Scorsese's highest grossing picture. He finally gets to make the movie he'd wanted to make for almost 3 decades, which was Silence. And then following that up, he makes The Irishman, a movie he had wanted to make for about 10 years, and it took him 9 years to get financing. And the Irishman itself actually had some controversy as well. There were some people who, again, I think had never watched a Martin Scorsese picture, and they're like, the women don't speak in this movie, which, again, everyone learn how to watch a movie. Anna Paquin's character is particularly criticized because she's silent, but if you were to watch this film, her silence has a point. She specifically knows what her dad does, despises him for it, and her silence is the only power she can really exert over her dad. The final scene we see her in, she's working at her job and he goes up to see her and she just puts a on a break sign up and walks away. And that, is such a cutting scene, and far more cutting, I think, than if her character had launched into a monologue. That idea of, I hate you so much, I want literally nothing to do with you. I don't even want to say that to you. It's one of the lowest points for the character in that film. In the 2010s, he also ventured into producing for television. He produced Boardwalk Empire, which did very well, lasted about 5 seasons. And there was Vinyl, which did not do very well. He also partnered with, in my opinion, national treasure Fran Lebowitz twice. First was for the 2010 documentary Public Speaking, and recently the Netflix series Pretend It's a City, which is a lot of fun if you haven't watched it. It is just basically two New York people talking about New York, and it's wonderful. So what would I like to highlight from 2010? Because actually, some of my favorite movies of his came from this decade. But I think above all, I would want to highlight Hugo, a film I saw kind of curious, like, what the heck is this man doing making a kids movie? And it's in 3D. This seemed like something Scorsese would decry as a gimmick. But it is a 100% sincere, beautifully made film. It's about an orphan boy. He lives in a train station. He runs into an old man who runs a toy store. It turns out to be George Melia, who is, if you've ever seen the trip to the moon, the rocket going in the moon's face, that's George Melia. Scorsese pretty much made this film as a big tribute to him and to the magic of cinema, the magic of movies. And it's such a personal movie for him. And also it's, I would say, other than Pacific Rim, like, I love that movie. It's giant monsters fighting giant robots. But other than Pacific Rim, this is the only film I have seen use 3D to its advantage. You're not seeing stuff come at you. You're rather just getting more of a sense of the depth of the scene you're in. There's a scene where Hugo is just standing in the snow, and you're like, oh, I can actually see the snow falling. I feel like I'm outside with him. And that's why Scorsese wanted to utilize 3D. I mean, he kind of saw it as a gimmick, but he also looked at it as, what if I used this to further the art rather than just make it a gimmick? What if I used it to completely complement the film? This actually did not make a lot of money. It wasn't a success, but it's found a second life on home video, and I would 100% recommend seeing it. Also, I think he was the first director to realize, oh, Sacha Baron Cohen can actually act and not be flamboyant, because Sacha Baron Cohen had a role in Sweeney Todd, but his role's a little more understated here. And also he saw, I think, Chloe Grace Moretz, who has, I think, become a very interesting young actress. I think he saw that she had something beyond Hit Girl in her, and is like, okay, I'm going to give you a character. But yeah, 100% recommend Hugo. It's a wonderful film, and if you're interested in early cinema, it's such a treat. I did not know that that was what this would be going in, so I was watching this like crying, like, oh my god, this is amazing. Just having a little fangirl fan moment. And now we are going to talk about Silence, which is Martin Scorsese's passion project. So as I was reading Conversations with Scorsese, it kind of went through every film he made in the process of getting it made. In so many of them from like the 90s on, he kept going, well, I really wanted to make this movie called Silence, but it just didn't work out. So in 2016, it finally did. Paul Moore, who was the man who wrote that letter to the editor defending The Last Temptation of Christ, just was a defender of the film. He met with Scorsese and, talking to him about the movie, but gave him a copy of Shisaku Endo's novel Silence, which is about two Jesuit priests. They go to Tokugawa era Japan at a time where Christianity is outlawed, to search for their mentor, who they have been told has apostatized. And part of it's to bring them back, part of it's to see if it's true, because for them, if you apostatize, i.e. renounce your faith, you're an outcast at that point. And both the book and the movie explore religion. They explore the concept of faith. They explore missionary work, the idea of, is this good what we're doing, or are we putting people in danger? It discusses persecution and the idea of martyrdom. So it also goes into this idea of, in this faith, martyrdom is something you should aspire to. But the film and the book as well kind of calls this into question, especially this idea of like, you're telling these new converts who might not have too much of an understanding of what they're supposed to do to die for something. Like, is this truly what we should be doing? Again, he had wanted to make this movie for decades, but what was interesting is watching his interview with James Martin. He's a Jesuit priest. It's both in print and there's on YouTube, you can watch the conversation between the two of them. Martin kind of said, he goes, it took me a while to really find the heart of this movie. And if that's the case, I'm very glad he waited, because I think, what he got is an incredibly thoughtful and compassionate film. And it doesn't offer any easy answers. There's a lot of questions here. And when I watched this movie, I think of what this film would have been like if, let's say, it had been made by like a PureFlix company. And if you're not familiar with PureFlix, they make movies like God's Not Dead. It would be a very different picture where everything would be black and white. And we have the good guys, which are the Jesuit priests. We have the bad guys, which are the Japanese. And granted, in Scorsese's film too, the two Jesuit priests are played by Andrew Garfield and Adam Driver are good characters. But there are some questions of like, are we really doing a good thing, spreading the word when we could be putting people in danger by doing this? And Scorsese also gives the Japanese, including the people who are persecuting the Japanese Christians, a chance to kind of tell their side of why they're doing this. And they basically say it is like, we have nothing personal against this, but we see you as an outside invading force trying to change our culture. And we're just trying to get rid of this. For a real historical context, the Japanese had seen and heard about what would, like in some cases, missionaries helped aid a lot of the more awful aspects of colonialism. So for them, they saw this not as people trying to spread the word, but as an invading force that might, mean, other people might start to exploit our country and exploit our resources. It's I think, a very spiritual film. It's a beautifully made film too. And there is a scene towards the end, which I, as someone who, full disclosure, I tend to be on the more atheist end of things, I was moved. I think it's a beautiful film. I think it is one of Martin Scorsese's best pictures. It is a long watch. It is 3 hours. And in many cases you have to sit with the silence. But it is a journey that is 100% worth taking. It was ignored when it came out because it came out in December. And the idea of a hard film that talks about persecution and martyrdom doesn't really sell people during the holidays, but I would love it if more people could discover it. And Scorsese really didn't care about the money. He just was very happy with the picture that he had made. And on a nicer end of it, Pope Francis watched it and was very happy with it. So it was much better received by the Catholic Church than The Last Temptation of Christ. But it really is a great film. It's one of his best works. I would put it in his top 5. And I hope that everyone comes away wanting to watch this film. So before we get on to the end, there's one other person I want to highlight. Anyone who knows anything about filmmaker knows a director doesn't do it alone. There's cinematographers, there's costumers, there's a lot of people that go into making a film. And in many cases, the director is the person that chooses these people because he knows their work and he knows that they can help him out. But every director's real secret weapon, and Todd, you can back this up, there are some directors who will work with one editor throughout their entire career because it really is a case of, exactly what I want and how to take my vision and make it workable. And that's Thelma Schoonmaker. She has worked with him since the 70s. Since his debut, so the 60s, she's won an Oscar 3 times. She is, again, there is a reason Martin works with her and only her. He has pretty much just said, like, she knows exactly what I want. She knows how to make my movies work. There's a great interview I read with her a while back where she was talking, I think, about Wolf of Wall Street. And she's like, sometimes I just have to tell him, Martin, this isn't in the movie. And that's what editors do in many cases. They are looking through hours upon hours worth of raw footage and trying to build something out of that. And her method is really fascinating as well. She says she only reads the script once, she doesn't read it again. And some of it is she's like, I try to kind of figure out, like, based on what I've read, what the vision is. But she's also like, I don't want to read that script too much because then it'll influence what I decide. Because as she said, sometimes what she thinks is in the movie isn't always what Martin thinks should be in the movie. So it's a little bit of background. She was born in Algeria when it was still under French rule, and she had initially wanted to work for the State Department, but she opposed the Vietnam War and was also not a fan of apartheid. So she was flagged as not being a good candidate. So really on the right side of history on that one, especially in regards to apartheid. And she got her editing job. Martin had put an ad in the paper looking for somebody, and she responded to it. So she edited his shorts. She edited Who's That Knocking at My Door. She had edited Woodstock to the point where she'd gotten an Oscar nomination for her work, but she couldn't be in the Motion Picture Editors Guild. And the reason was they have strict rules of, like, you have to do an apprenticeship for such and such amount of hours. She's like, wait a minute. I've worked on movies. I've worked on shorts. I just got nominated for an Oscar doing this stuff. I'm not going to go backwards and do an apprenticeship. So she couldn't really officially work with him throughout the 70s, although they've pretty much admitted now she did some unofficial work on Taxi Driver. But he eventually got her admitted into Scorsese got her admitted into the union, and she has been editing every single one of his films since Raging Bull. She's won an Oscar 3 times. I think she's the most nominated editor at this point. And again, if not for her, the movies that we love would not be those movies. So hats off to her and just editors in general. They do a lot of great work. And Martin's other passion is film preservation, which, again, when the whole MCU thing started, and again, people going, oh, you're a dinosaur, what do you know about movies? My other thought was, Martin Scorsese has done more to protect cinema than most people have. He founded the Film Foundation in 1990, basically to work and preserve older films. The big one was Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger's The Red Shoes, which is one of Martin Scorsese's favorite pictures. That was his big project, which Criterion has it. I think they've recently released it on 4K. The Red Shoes restoration print is one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. It's that beautiful Technicolor. It's an amazing restoration. And he also has the World Cinema Project. So he tries to go around the world and preserve films and also try to highlight movies from countries that people don't necessarily think of as film countries. So we're like, oh yeah, Japan, France, Germany. We all know they make cinema. We all know they have their own cinematic worlds. But he'll also go to places like Indonesia, Mexico, Senegal, Egypt, Armenia, Kazakhstan, and he has preserved those films, in some cases made them available to watch here. So he loves to highlight cinema from all around the world. And most recently, he's launched the African Film Heritage Project. He launched that after being inspired by seeing the film Mandabi, and just that idea of like, oh, I should, there was this whole Black cinema movement in the 60s and 70s. And, he's worked with the Pan-African Federation of Filmmakers to try to preserve classics of African cinema. Some of the ones he's helped restore are on the Criterion Collection now. Mandabi is one of them. Black Girl is another. And I would say, other than the films he's already made, this is going to be his contribution to cinema, potentially even his greater one, because he has saved films that potentially might have just languished in obscurity, or just the film prints could have degraded to the point where no one could have seen them again. So the fact that he has saved small films from all over the world, or has enabled the saving of films from all over the world, is an amazing contribution. So we are going to have to talk about this to wrap up. Martin on Marvel. So Empire Online in 2009. Someone asked him about Marvel movies and just what movies he's excited about. And he just said, well, I don't see them. I tried, but that's not cinema. The closest I can think of them is as well made as they are, with actors doing the best they can under the circumstances, is theme parks. It isn't cinema of human beings trying to convey emotional, psychological experiences to another human being. And again, the internet blew up. And some of that is interesting. I think because in our society, we define ourselves by so much by what we consume. So a lot of people going to go, oh, I'm a Marvel fan. I watch the Marvel movies. They took this as a very personal insult, which, by the way, Francis Ford Coppola said these movies are literally destroying cinema. Martin went light. Martin just said, not for me. It's fine. And honestly, I think the theme park is, pretty fair. And he elaborated on this, saying, like, look, I loved some of these, the old serial movies when I was a kid, but he's like, I still wouldn't put them as cinema. For him, cinema is films that are truly trying to convey emotion, to tell a story, versus, the MCU movies. As he puts it, many franchise films are made by people of considerable talent and artistry. You can see it on the screen. The fact that the films themselves don't interest me is a matter of personal taste and temperament. I know that if I were younger, if I'd come of age at a later time, I might have been excited by these pictures and maybe even wanted to make one myself. But I grew up when I did, and I developed a sense of movies, of what they were and what they could be. That was as far from the Marvel universe as we are on Earth from Alpha Centauri. And so he also talked about in his big editorial for the New York Times the problem of what happens when the theme parks take over. And that really is what's happening now with franchises, with studios trying to get into the global market. They're basically trying to make money makers. And it's becoming cinema kind of being relegated to the smaller, more independent fields, and then just all tentpole movies. And as he put it, that's not good for anybody. That is not good for art. And really his editorial is kind of an argument for making art for art's sake, because at the end of the day, these MCU movies are here to make money. There are some directors who can put their spin on it. Taika Waititi puts his spin on the Thor movies. That's kind of the only one I can think. Apparently, Chloe Zhao tried to put her spin on a Marvel movie. Whether that was successful or not, I don't know, because I haven't seen it. But they are all, for the most part, kind of factory assembled at this point, in terms of we know all the beats of them. But if you go to the cinema right now, you don't see too many original stories, or if they come out, people don't see them. So what he says is the situation is that we now have two separate fields. So it's the worldwide audiovisual entertainment, and then there's cinema. They still overlap from time to time, but that's becoming increasingly rare. And I fear that the financial dominance of one is being used to marginalize and even belittle the existence of another. For anyone who dreams of making movies or is just starting out, the situation at this moment is brutal and inhospitable to art. And the act of simply writing those words fills me with terrible sadness. So he doesn't so much hate the MCU movies. I mean, he just kind of feels aesthetically they're not for him. But his main criticism really is what that represents to filmmakers in terms of who want to tell their stories. And I mean, I personally think it's a little scary that there's a lot of small filmmakers who they seem to just immediately be picked up by Disney, who, by the way, owns half of the intellectual property in the world right now, seemingly, and says, here, we're just going to try to mold you into something we want you to make rather than not. And that's why I have like Edgar Wright, who his recent film Last Night in Soho is out, which is great. He left Ant-Man kind of because he's like, okay, I have a movie I want to make. You don't want me to do that. I'm not doing this. Marvel will say they let him go. Edgar Wright kind of tells a slightly different story, but overall for him, it was like, look, I have an artistic vision I want. If you're not going to let me do that, then I'm leaving. But this is one where I'll be like, I think Martin Scorsese is right. It's okay to like these movies. He's not calling you bad if you like them, but what they represent for the industry and art is not looking great. So before we end and go to questions, just a couple things he's working on. Killers of the Flower Moon is coming out next year, is reteaming with Leonardo DiCaprio. He is doing a documentary on SCTV, which I am looking forward to. a film on the life of Teddy Roosevelt, which there's a lot of meat on those bones. I'm interested to see what he does. And the one I'm actually the most excited for, an adaptation of Devil in the White City, because that book is fantastic. So we got about 5 minutes. And all right. Oh, someone else loves Thelma. Awesome. Anyone have any questions? Again, we have about 5 minutes to go. Or recommendations. I can talk about Silence some more if you'd like. Let's see. Anybody can put stuff in the chat. Someone said thank you. I would say, Todd, what would you consider to be Scorsese's best picture?
Oh,
That's a hard one. Actually, everyone, put your favorite Scorsese movie in the chat. I'd like to hear what y'all think.
Best, it's tough to say, but if you have to ask me which one I'm going to give a shout out to, I know we already kind of tooted its horn, but I'm going to go with the King of Comedy on this one because, again, it's alongside After Hours, it's Scorsese doing a dark comedy, although I'd argue it is considerably the darker of the two. Oh, yeah. And also, I have to give a shout out as far as De Niro, because for a guy who often gets cast as these very intimidating, tough guy performances, it's fascinating seeing him play, say, this genuinely kind of sad, pathetic person to the point where we get to the climax of the film and he's doing what's supposed to be his big break stand-up and he's laying himself out there and realizing, oh God, this man is damaged. Well, it's kind of another side of the Travis Bickle coin, because I would consider Bickle a very sad and damaged person who just scares me because, especially now in the wake of, we've seen like Elliot Rodgers, these people go online and get radicalized or just depressed to the point where they feel the only thing they can do is inflict violence on other people. It's, again, there's a prescience about that that's very terrifying, that looking at it in 2021 eyes, I'm like, oh God, Taxi Driver somehow scarier. If I had to say his best, it's probably a tie between Goodfellas, Age of Innocence, and I would put Last Temptation of Christ up there. I think that movie is beautiful, and the final 5 minutes of that movie, just Willem Dafoe's performance, just saying like, let me be the Messiah, in that final line of "it is accomplished." I'm like, it's beautiful filmmaking. And I would put Silence in the top 5. Silence was one of the most moving experiences I'd had watching a film in the past 5 years. And it's a beautiful looking movie too. Oh, can you comment on the situation with the film Rust? I can do that, and then I gotta go because I am senior staff tonight. Long story short, don't cut costs and hire people who aren't willing to follow safety measures. I think that's number one. And I know a lot of people were blaming Alec Baldwin, the actor. They're like, he should have checked his gun. And I'm like, guys, on a film set, there's people who are there to do that for you. In many cases, they don't want actors messing with prop weapons because they're like, we have fixed this up. So I don't think, and they were rehearsing for a scene. So Alec Baldwin, the actor, I don't think is at fault. Alec Baldwin is the producer. I think that remains to be seen. It's just coming out that it was a very chaotic and not safe set. And I think, producers need to be held responsible for that. But yeah, it's a sad situation. I think the people who are trying to turn it into a gotcha situation for Alec Baldwin I'm just like, guys, a person's dead. A person's dead who shouldn't be, and stop trying to turn this into a point score. But yeah, kind of relates to the IATSE union has been in negotiations for better conditions. And I think they're in contract negotiations right now, but this is an example of why people who follow safety are good to have on set, because stuff like this doesn't and shouldn't happen. But I do have to go. We will see you next month for Godzilla, where Todd takes the wheel, everyone's favorite big green lizard. And I will see you all next month. Have a great evening.
Solo was great job.
Oh, thank you.